You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening all, and welcome to another evening full of the past and paranormal with me, your host, Penny G. Morgan, here on Haunted Histories, Parasearch Radio. Last week was just me on my little lonely old Todd talking about the London docks. It's definitely a fascinating place, and I wish I could have stepped back in time to see what it was like in its heyday. But funnily enough, I was catching up with the most recent season of Ripper Street on BBC Two recently, which is based in East London for those people who've never watched it. And they were at the docks. Well, it was actually one of the bad guys was at the docks buying some animals, some wolves to be precise, from a company called Jamracks. Well, if you remember last week, Jamrack was the company that brought the tiger in which attacked the little boy. Continuity, huh? Ain't it grand? And no, I didn't know Jamrack was going to be in Ripper Street when I was researching for last week's show, but I did get a little burst of pride and a touch of excitement. In fact, I had to explain to my husband why I was laughing and squealing at the same time watching this. Anyway, history's good, isn't it? So this week, well, after the break, I'll be joined by the lovely Sean Calvert of Ghost Ventures to talk about the amazing and ever so slightly imposing Warwick Castle. The structure has stood since the days of William the Conqueror, and there is even evidence that before that, during the Saxon days, around 914 AD, an Anglo-Saxon burh was established. A burh being an ancient English type of fortified settlement, which had fortification instigated by Ethelfleda, who was the daughter of Alfred the Great. The burh she established was one of 10 which defended Mercia against the invading Danes. Its position allowed it to dominate the Fosse Way, as well as the river valley and the crossing over the River Avon. So, with quite literally thousands of years of history and historical events to choose from, I was in a bit of a quandary of what to choose. And then it came to me, the War of the Roses. Now, I will admit, I don't know much about, or I didn't know much about the War of the Roses. My main qualification to be able to talk about these being that my mother is from Lancashire and my dad is from Yorkshire. But I felt it would be an interesting subject to talk about. It is full of murder, intrigue and deceit. I tell you what, history is better than any soap opera you can concoct. If anyone wants to watch a really good historical programme on Netflix, and I hope it's not just me that finds these interesting, there's one about castles called Secrets of Great British Castles. It's written and presented by historian and author Dan Jones. It really is well worth a watch, and I have to admit, it was watching it that gave me the idea to actually talk about the War of the Roses as opposed to anything else. Dan is a really good historian, and he gives real insight and energy into the medieval events of those times, which can sometimes be a bit hard work to learn about, as there's very little modern-day evidence of them, as opposed to the periods in history which I really enjoy talking about from the 1800s onwards. But I do recommend this programme, or this series. It's really, really interesting. And so Dan is a very, very good historian, and puts a really good sort of light, throws a really good light on the events. Anyway, Warwick. Well, as I said, the castle has been around in some form or another since about 914 AD. But it wasn't until the reign of Henry II from 1154 to 1189 that the Motte and Bailey that was there was turned actually into a stone castle and became more akin to the imposing and domineering structure that we see today. The main family, for at least a few hundred years anyway, who were linked to the castle were the de Beauchamps, and it wasn't until 1312 that it all started to go a bit wrong for them. If you watch Dan's documentary on Warwick, he almost alludes to the fact that the property could be perceived as being cursed, as some pretty gory stuff has happened there. We should make our chat with Sean later all the more interesting when we talk the paranormal. When it came to a French nobleman who was the then confidant of the then King Edward II, now, let's be honest, if you read the reports in history, Edward probably wasn't a very well respected king by all accounts, although that is hearsay. His friendship with this French nobleman, Piers Gaveston, who was actually that he bequeathed an earldom to, so he was actually the first Earl of Cornwall, was actually seen to be something more. So much so, the Gaveston was actually exiled twice, including once by said King Edward II, the first time having been by the King's father Edward I. Now, if Gaveston and Edward II were lovers, no one is to know for real, but a lot of other noblemen were very upset at the amount of favour this Frenchman was receiving from their king, so decided to get rid of him. When Gaveston returned to England from exile in 1312, Guy de Beauchamp, who was the 10th Earl of Warwick, and some other noblemen, it has to be said, captured him, imprisoned him in Warwick Castle, and then had him executed on some fangled charge of theft of stuff and treason and all that kind of thing. It was actually 1449 where the de Beauchamp line ended at Warwick, and this was when Richard Neville became the Earl of Warwick due to inheritance through his wife's name. Also known as Warwick the Kingmaker, here was a man with such devious machinations and swift change of allegiance that it was any wonder that he came a cropper eventually. But this is also the start of the War of the Roses, and the area I'm actually going to cover in more depth for you. Neville, Richard Neville, was actually born in November of 1428, and he was the son of Richard Neville, who was the 5th Earl of Salisbury. So he would have also been the 6th Earl of Salisbury on his father's death. But why was he known as Warwick the Kingmaker? What did this mean? And what plotting and corruption had Neville actually been part of? Well, from 1455 to 1485 was what's known as the Battle of the Roses. For those of you who don't actually know anything about the Battle of the Roses, back in the 1400s there was a series of battles for the throne of England between two branches of the Plantagenet family, who were the ruling family at the time. This was between the House of York, which was represented by a white rose, and the House of Lancaster, represented by a red rose, hence the Battle of Roses, and hence why, when I've got parents from opposing sides of the Pennines, I feel that I had the War of the Roses going on in my house constantly, or maybe more in my head than in my house, but there you go. The power struggle between the two houses ignited around social and financial troubles following the actual 100 Years' War, something we probably end up talking about one day. Combined with the mental infirmity and weak rule of the then King, Henry VI, this revived interest in Richard of York's claim to the throne, Henry being part of the Lancaster group. However, historians, as always, disagree as to whether this was due to the weak and pathetic rule of Henry VI, or whether it was just more feudalistic in nature, as tended to be in those days. With the Duke of York's death, the claim then transferred to his heir, Edward, who later became actually the first Yorkist King of England as Edward IV. His son then reigned for 86 days as Edward V, but Parliament then decided that Edward and his brother Richard were actually illegitimate, and offered the crown to Edward IV's younger brother, who became Richard III. The two young princes disappeared within the confines of the Tower of London. For those of you who remember my early episode back in, I think it was April, on the Tower of London, the princes in the tower, the mystery that has never been properly solved, the discovery of 2 skeletons in the stairwell relatively recently that had been identified as being the right age. Yep, this all links back to this. Anyone would think I had planned it this way, but it's not. It's just a lucky, or unlucky I suppose some might say, coincidence. The first major Battle of the Roses was in St Albans in 1455, where Richard of York, accompanied by the Nevilles of Salisbury and Warwick and other supporters, defeated the Royalist army, and it led to the capture of Henry VI. With Henry captured, Parliament appointed Richard of York as Lord Protector. It was this battle and the subsequent actions that followed that really kick-started the career of Richard Neville as a Kingmaker, the title he became later known as. But the fighting didn't stop there. The Lancaster House, or the House of Lancaster, whichever way you want to look at it, was encouraged to fight back against the York contingent, forcing them to flee the country. But in 1459, good old Neville invaded from Calais and took Henry VI prisoner. Again. York, again, became Lord Protector. Funnily enough, the House of Lancaster, and in particular a lady by the name of Margaret Zanjou, were not happy with this, and began to accumulate forces in the north of the country. When York moved north to engage them, he and his second son Edmund were killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December of 1460. The Lancastrian army advanced south and released Henry at the Second Battle of St Albans, but failed to occupy London and subsequently retreated to the north. York's other son, Edward, the Earl of March, was proclaimed King Edward IV. He gathered the Yorkist armies and won a crushing victory at the Battle of Towton in March of 1461. Now this Margaret Zanjou, who was she? Well, apart from at times leading the Lancaster faction and also being the main protagonist, or so it's believed by historians, as to the initial spark that ignited the tinderbox that became the War of the Roses, she was also Henry VI's wife. And not only that, she was the cousin of Louis XI of France. You can't really blame her for wanting to try and help her husband's cause, really, especially as Henry is said to have been begotten by severe mental illness at times, and also is said to have had no interest in military matters at all, and would rather sit and read books and be a more learned scholar of a king. Anyway, so Richard of York's son is now on the throne, but Richard Warwick, the Kingmaker Neville, is not happy, as although now his position has inroads into the monarchy and had become pretty darn strong and assured, Warwick started to regret his choice of Edward as king, when after negotiations with the French for a royal marriage, Edward admitted he was actually already married to a lady by the name of Elizabeth Woodville. Oops. So this is where Warwick started to change his allegiance and starts to see the Lancastrian side as being perhaps the better one to side with. I can kind of see why he would be annoyed. He had spent all that time, all that energy to get Edward on the throne, had worked incredibly hard to form an allegiance with France, who, don't forget, the antagonism between England and France was huge. And then the king had kept secret his marriage from his trusted adviser, and had also made Warwick look a complete and utter fool to the French. I wouldn't be happy either, would you? So, this Kingmaker, who had been fundamental in taking the power from Henry VI to give to Edward IV, York, so Lancaster to York, then managed to have it given back again to Lancastrian Henry VI in 1470. Bouncing around, isn't it? York, Lancaster, Lancaster, York. Well, to cut what might be a very, very long story short, there was another big battle. As Edward, by this point, had realised that he was being tricked, and he went to fight the Lancastrians again at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Now, This is almost comical if it wasn't so tragic, but the weather was so foggy that the Lancastrian army became confused and ended up fighting itself. And not being able to see the Yorkists, started turning on themselves. Warwick, realising that it was all a bit of a disaster, really. I was going to use another term, but I won't. Starts with cluster. He realised that it was not going quite the way he planned, and he rode away in defeat. Apparently, he's meant to have laid down his sword when surrounded by the Yorkist forces, admitting defeat and surrendering. But he was then cut down from his own horse and killed. So, you might think it ends there. No. The king wants retribution. He displayed Warwick and Warwick's brother Montague, displayed their bodies in St. Paul's Cathedral, bloodied, dead, naked, for all to see. Whether this was to be a final embarrassment for them, or to quell any rumours of their survival, who knows? But I would have guessed if they were looking down, it would have been quite an indignity for them. However, normally in this time, treason, for that's what this would have been classed as, would normally have been met with being hung, drawn and quartered. So perhaps Edward did take a modicum of pity on his former adviser and the Kingmaker who'd got him onto the throne in the first place. But if you don't think that that kind of ending for someone smacks of something curse-related, listen to some of the other events associated with Warwick Castle. By the way, regardless of what I'm saying, it really is a magnificent building, so do go and visit if you get a chance. I'm sure the bad luck only applies to those individuals who actually live in it and own it, or at least it seems to be. So, Warwick's died. Edward IV gives Warwick's estate to Edward's brother, Clarence. Then Clarence's son, Edward, inherits. As the last Plantagenet, and therefore a potential rival to the now King Henry VII, Edward is imprisoned in the Tower of London and executed. Not immediately, though, as he was only 10 years old when he was first imprisoned there. They waited until he was 21 before he was executed. He was even said by some to be mentally impaired, but as a lot of historians have pointed out, he was kept devoid of human interaction or company or any kind of learning for 11 years. It would be a little wonder that he appeared slightly devoid of, common sense, I suppose. Although the observation of him being mentally impaired is based entirely on a statement by the chronicler Edward Hall that Warwick had been kept in prison for so long, out of all company of men and sight of beasts, in so much that he could not discern a goose from a capon, however it's pronounced. Anyway, this amazing building, the castle of Warwick Castle, fell into disrepair with no one living there or using it as a fortress. It does make me wonder, though, were castles designed to be homes, fortresses, or just shows of wealth and status? Or possibly all three? Anyway, in 1604, James I gave the castle to Fulk Greville, who has to spend the modern equivalent of millions of pounds to get the property into a fit state to inhabit. Probably a bit of a poisoned chalice, really, as 24 years later Greville himself is murdered by his manservant. In fact, the manservant then turned the knife on himself. The reason being is he was perturbed at the amount he'd been left in Greville's will, and that's why he killed him. Bit of a strange thing to do, seeing as if you want to change someone's will, surely killing them probably isn't the best thing, but anyway. But Greville didn't actually die there and then, and this is a bit manky, and that's the best technical term I can think of, because what I'm about to describe, for those of a nervous disposition, you might want to cover your ears for the next 30 seconds or so. So Greville. Greville was quite rich. He was actually a poet and a writer. And he was taken to what would have been the Elizabethan equivalent of a surgeon for treatment. Greville's physicians treated his wounds by filling them, and here we go, with pig fat, rather than disinfecting them. Surprisingly enough, the pig fat turned rancid and infected the wounds, and he died actually in agony 4 weeks after the attack. His body was actually brought back to Warwick, and he was buried in the Collegiate Church of St Mary, Warwick. But I'm not quite sure what they were thinking putting a foreign substance like pig fat into a wound. There must have been some kind of logic to it. They do actually talk about that in that Dan Jones programme on Warwick Castle that I mentioned, and he actually does talk to a surgeon to ask him for the logic behind it. It's very interesting. Anyway, only 38 years later, the castle was actually under siege due to the First English Civil War. Remember us talking in earlier episodes about the Roundheads and the Cavaliers? Cavaliers being the ones who were very sort of flouncy with the hair and the extravagant plumes in their hats and such. Well, the Roundheads were also known as parliamentarians, and the Grevilles were just that, parliamentarians. But due to the dungeons which had been built into Warwick, and not all dungeons were actually underground. We'll talk about this probably a bit later when we talk to Sean, but some dungeons were in towers. Hence, things like that you get people locked up in the towers. But Warwick did hold a lot of Civil War prisoners, royalists or cavaliers as they were also known, and those prisoners inscribed things into the walls for all to see 400 years later. Now, although dungeons weren't always the deep, dark, dank structures we would picture, and many were in fact in the tallest tower, because how would you have got out? At Warwick, they also have one of the scariest types of, I suppose, imprisonment enclosures that I think that there is. Something called, it's a French thing, called an oubliette. Now, an oubliette, or sometimes known, it roughly translates to the forgotten room, was a punishment I would have said worse than being put in a conventional castle dungeon. And although a castle dungeon could be dark and dank and everything, at least you had space. Well, an oubliette was a tiny vertical shaft, which was often only large enough for the individual to actually just stand up in. They wouldn't have been able to crouch down, to kneel, to sit, or even perhaps turn around in. They would have been lowered into this shaft by a guardsman, and once they reached the bottom, the rope would have been taken up and the trapdoor above them would have been closed. Often, these shafts were so deep that there would have been absolutely no way to reach up to the trapdoor. In the oubliette, the prisoner would have been forced to remain standing, in the dark, the pitch black, until they were released, if ever. Food and water might have been thrown down to them if they were lucky, or if their survival was seen to be important, but it was, even if it was only for a short space of time, a truly horrible punishment. Some prisoners who were put into these oubliettes were basically left so long that they went mad, and without food or water, their insides would pretty much their bodies would start to eat themselves from the inside, their membranes would start to dry out and bleed. It was pretty horrific, pretty nasty. Still think that Warwick is somewhere you would have liked to have owned, with all that responsibility? No thanks. Interesting fact though. We're going to go a bit more light-hearted now. I think we should, shouldn't we? Well, Frances Evelyn, known as Daisy Greville, who was the Countess of Warwick, she lived from December 1861 to the 26th of July 1938, was a British socialite and married to Francis Greville, and she was also a bit of a naughty girl, this one, the long-time mistress to Albert Edward, who was the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII. I believe she was probably the mistress to quite a few others of that circle, known as the Marlborough House set, if rumour were to be believed. I suppose it's almost like an olden Edwardian version of Made in Chelsea, I guess. Anyway, the interesting fact is she was the inspiration behind the popular musical song Daisy Daisy. Now, I'm not going to put you through singing to it. I'll just remind you. Daisy Daisy, give me your answer do. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. Anyway, you know the song. I don't need to tell you it. But lots of parodies were made of this song. And I found this one when I was researching this subject, and I think this is probably the best I've seen, and it did make me chuckle. Anyway. Michael, Michael, here is my answer true. You're half crazy if you think that will do. If you can't afford a carriage, there won't be any marriage, 'cause I'll be switched if I'll get hitched on a bicycle built for two. Good lass, stand your ground. Who wants to marry someone who can't even afford a carriage? Anyway, on that lighter note, and after nearly 30 minutes of basically talking about murder, treason and misdirection, let's have a quick break, and then we're going to speak to our Sean of Ghost Ventures. But first, here's Harry.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And we're back. Well, thank you for joining us for the second half of this Haunted Histories episode on Warwick Castle. I'm joined now by Sean Calvert-Secklow, who works with Ghost Ventures and has investigated Warwick on quite a few occasions. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Penny. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
Very, very good, thank you. Very good.
Good, good. Now, I understand from the Ghost Ventures team that you know Warwick Castle quite well. You've done quite a few investigations there, so we'll be able to quiz you on your experiences.
Definitely.
Of the magnificent and slightly imposing building that the Warwick Castle is. But first things first, for me being nosy, I can't help it. How did you get into the paranormal and paranormal investigating and all that kind of thing?
Well, it's something that's always interested me. Ever since I was a kid, really found it fascinating. And so we found ourselves with a group of family and friends who are all of a similar mindset. Oh, they're sort of interesting, all coming at it from very different perspectives. People who feel they're sensitive to spirits, people like myself who are quite skeptical but inquisitive and think, well, that's interesting. Where's that happening from? Others who are absolute skeptics and are wanting to disprove everything. And we started going around sort of various investigations as guests on other groups. And on one particular one, we were slightly disappointed to find the guys kind of faking it, trying to make things happen. Yeah. And we found that quite sort of disappointing. So we decided we'd set up our own group, and that's what we've done. And we pride ourselves that we'd never fake anything. If all you get is a group of people walking around Warwick Castle in the middle of the night in this incredible, stunning setting, and nothing happens, well, blimey, just look around you and look at where you are. Yeah. And that's the sort of that's the kind of ethos and the energy we bring to every investigation we go to is nothing might happen tonight. Yeah. We've not found that ever happen yet.
No, I haven't.
There's always something going on, and Warwick, my word, what a location! You ask anybody to close their eyes and picture their perfect castle, and I bet you 9 times out of 10 they're picturing something like Warwick Castle.
Probably it is like one of your iconic British sort of constructions, really, isn't it? The way it's sort of the towers and the big, because it's still intact as well.
That's
probably, it. Yeah. So it was literally just a group of friends who thought, let's have a go at this. That's how you got into it.
Let's go and see. Let's give it a whirl. Let's turn the lights off and let's open ourselves up and see what happens.
Can you remember where your first investigation was?
Warwick Castle.
Oh, it was actually Warwick.
It was actually Warwick. And I had a very strange So this is when I was very, very, very fresh and new to these things, and we were in an area which I'm sure you'll talk about later on, the Kingmaker, and I felt like some small child held my hand, and I knew it was small because it was a feeling on just 2 fingers on my hand.
Yeah,
and it was a very strange. And I sort of made myself known to one of the investigators who were taking us round and said, I think there's something here. And they held up their EMF meter, and sure enough, the whole thing lit up. And that was my first kind of experience. And I was like, that is really interesting. And I wasn't expecting anything to happen. And that really, really got me interested in the whole field. And again, got that energy to move forward.
You must have a very gentle personality then, because I don't find, or I haven't found, that kids tend to go to men very often. So you must have had a nurturing personality. Well, children don't in general, do they? Small children, they tend to gravitate more towards women.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, but it was the strange thing, and it was probably about the only thing that directly happened to me that night. But it really touched me. And going back on subsequent investigations, we've often found childlike entities to interact with in that area, and also in one of the towers as well.
All right, but there's no record of children ever being kept there, is there? Not by prison, in prison, so to speak.
Certainly not in prison. Obviously, in its time, it was a place for families.
Yes, so there would have been children, but
lots of different things there, and there's some sort of legends to do with children in that area that aren't particularly pleasant. But we don't know if we're picking up on that. But it's a wonderful place. I absolutely love it.
Okay, so what has been, other than Warwick?
Yeah.
Other than Warwick, what's been your favourite place that you've investigated?
We really, really enjoyed Oxford Castle and Prison.
All right.
There was a very unusual experience down in the crypt there, which dates back to sort of the 1100s. It's one of the original parts underneath what is now the prison, this original crypt. We were using an electromagnetic field detector. We've got 2 of them going, and we found an area within the crypt where the EMF was going off. We tried to sort of rule out electronic interference, all phones on flight mode and this sort of thing. But we were picking up this signal almost that we could talk to, flash the lights for yes, leave it blank for no.
Yeah.
We asked some very specific questions. We got some very specific answers around dates, names, all sorts of things from sort of people shouting things out and seeing what lit up. And we were able then to go back to the sort of the restroom after we'd finished our stint down in the crypt and actually Google this and find a person who matched all this information that we'd been given down there. And I must admit, it was, even for a slight skeptic like me, I was surprised. And being amongst a group of family and friends who you trust, you know that, well, for one thing, who's going to have such specific knowledge about a particular person from Oxford in the 1200s or whatever? And it was
that far back. It was like
it was that far back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I teach philosophy, and it was lots of very interesting things. But one thing I thought was really fascinating when we were talking and asking the questions, somebody asked the question, "Are you dead?" And it didn't give the flash to confirm a positive. So there was, "Oh, you're still alive?" Yes. I found that really interesting. That, well, why would you? Perhaps you don't know, or perhaps you're not. Perhaps
I've had that. I have actually experienced that before with spirits. They don't realise they're dead.
Yeah.
They still think that it is almost a case of some of those films you see where it's like, who's the dead one and who's the alive one, and it's like they don't realise they're dead. So they're like, well, why are these people in my space? Why aren't they talking to me almost? Because I have actually experienced that it myself on questions when I've been sort of having a, I suppose, want of a better word, a conversation with a spirit. So, but to have one that's that old, that's quite that's quite amazing. So, is there a place that's unnerved you that you've actually had to steel yourself to go into or go back into?
There are. We were at a place called Avenue House in North London.
Yeah, I know it. I've not actually been to Avenue House, but I do know of it, yeah.
Yeah, and I had a very unusual experience in the basement there. With very much like yourself, I like to know the history of a place when I go there, not as a something to sort of fence you in, but as something to just give you a basis and maybe of an understanding. Because personally, not being in the least bit sensitive to anything to do with spirits, I have to go on feelings. Whereas I'm so envious of those people who are open to it, who can get this sort of information just by standing there and just being aware of these people. And we were down.
It's not always that great, I promise you. Sometimes it can be a bit of a pain.
Everybody says that. It's very much a two-edged sword, isn't it? When it's good, but the things it must also open you up to must be quite scary at times. And so I don't envy it by any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't want that for myself, but I find it amazing when people are. And when we were in the basement, and I honestly felt like somebody kicked my foot as if they were running past. And at that exact moment, one of the group who's sensitive was saying, oh, there's loads of people rushing in here. And even though we're in a small space, there's far too many people. There's far too many people all coming in here. And I won't spoil for anybody who wants to go to think, but there was actually a historic reason why that would happen. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And then I was actually leading a group around that night, and somebody had left a piece of equipment back down there. And we were up in the top, and I had to go through the whole place in the dark on my own to go and get the piece of equipment. And I was just walking through there thinking, I've seen enough horror films. I know it's always the one that goes off on their own that gets picked up.
Just don't go up. Don't go up.
And I must admit, going through that place on my own in the dark, that very much unnerved me.
Right.
But the odd thing is, Warwick Castle, I'm struggling to think of any parts of the castle where I would feel that if I was on my own.
Right.
I find Warwick has got for me, warmest atmosphere of. I feel very calm there. Maybe one of the towers, maybe the Bear Tower. There's something off there. I've been with a number of groups who've gone into the Bear Tower and have felt, there is something not good in here. But
isn't it the Bear Tower though that they used as one of the prisons?
It is.
It is, yeah. I thought it was. Yeah. So that could be why.
Yeah.
So where would be your dream location to investigate if money was no object, if accessibility was automatically available anywhere?
Well, it's not glamorous particularly, but I would love to do an investigation in Blackpool Tower.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I had family over in Blackpool. I had a great aunt that lived there, and she was for a while a contortionist in the circus there, and she retired. She retired there, and we'd go there every year as kids. And there is a particular box that we would sit in when we went to. I would go there with my grandparents. There's a particular place we'd always sit when we went to the Tower Ballroom because my nan and granddad liked a bit of ballroom dancing. They also liked to watch the ballroom dancing. So we'd sit on the first level and we'd look down on the ballroom floor and we'd watch the people going round. And I would like to go back there in the dark on my own, sit on those particular seats and just see if I could actually even connect with something of my own past.
Have you ever contacted them to see if you can do it?
No. I mean, I'm actually now saying it, I'm thinking, well, actually, why not?
What's the worst they're going to say? No?
But I mean, also just for that huge sort of Victorian building that's had so many people go through it and so much happen in there and fires and all sorts, I think it would be an amazing place to do an investigation in the actual tower building.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant one. I think you should contact them.
Yeah.
I do, because like I say, what's the worst they're going to say?
Yeah.
I mean, the worst they are going to say is, no, sorry, we're not interested. But with your connection to them, if you said as well that, you know, the connections from childhood and all of that thing, I think you should. I think when we hang up this call, that's what you should be doing.
I think I might.
And if me pushing you helps you achieve a dream, Sean, then that's even better.
I'll be right back on to tell you all about it, Penny. I promise.
It's a deal. It's a deal. Never thought of Blackpool Tower, actually. That's a really interesting one. Oh, actually, I don't even know how old the tower. Is it Victorian, sort of mid
Victorian,
1800s?
yeah, sort of late Victorian.
Ah,
So I think it'd just be, and it's had all sorts of things. It's been a zoo, and there's obviously been the circus there, and
yeah,
all the different things. There's been a couple of fires. It's had a real amazing history,
yeah.
and yeah, I think it'd be well worth a look.
Ah, I think. Yep.
Yeah.
Keep me posted.
Will
Keep me
do.
posted on that one. Um. Well, thank you for that little insight into your sort of paranormal, I don't know, mentality, I suppose.
Yeah.
Warwick Castle. One of the things I mentioned in my little history bit before we spoke was the War of the Roses.
Yeah.
And Richard Neville, also known as Warwick the Kingmaker, and explained a bit about why he was known as the Kingmaker, and also that perhaps his machinations, for want of a better word, caught up with him when basically he decided to swap sides, and the battle didn't go too well, and his own soldiers sort of started trying to kill each other, sort of thing. And you mentioned the Kingmakers Room just now as being one of the places. What sort of things happened there?
We've had a number of things in the Kingmaker. Certainly,
And why is it called the Kingmaker? Why is it called that?
That's simply because he had the ability to give out that.
No, the room itself. Why is it called?
It's actually a large sort of exhibition.
Right.
And it basically it's a series of rooms, and they take you back to that time. So you'll see different sort of domestic settings in there, people working, kitchens, people preparing, garrisons, these sorts of things. And I have to say, for anybody who's going down there on a night investigation, be prepared, because the mannequins that they use down there, the models, are phenomenally real. They really are. And when you first walk in,
I'm laughing because I did a fort recently, and they had some mannequins, and they hadn't warned some of the people as we were walking down the corridors that these mannequins were in these little sort of rooms.
Yeah.
And somebody shone a torch. She went, "Oh my God, it's a ghost!" Yeah. And I said, "It's a mannequin." So that's why I was laughing. Sorry.
Lots of those. And they're really, I mean, you go up to them and you think that they are about to move. They are phenomenal. But all through here, there's a series of rooms, and we've had lots of experiences of people, certainly our sensitives, picking up on various things, certainly lots of different atmospheres. We've had a lot of temperature fluctuations. But what you've also got to bear in mind is that all of these rooms back out onto the river, so there's a large weir that runs down the back of the castle,
right.
and so there's a lot of, if you try and do any sort of voice recordings in there, you get a lot of static sound because of the white noise that comes from the river.
So there's noise contamination that you have to be very careful with.
There's a lot down there. We've had a lot of really good experience with the EMF detectors down there, and on the last investigation we did, we probably had about a 15-minute conversation, if you will, with a 4-year-old girl spirit. That's how the responses came through. But there was something I found really touching about this. This was while we were talking, it was as if if we were to assume there really was an entity there, it was as if the entity wandered off and came back, like a 4-year-old would, Actually,
would lose interest for a bit and then want to come back. And
when we were talking about going, okay, then, well, obviously you're a bit tired and we'll go. Then it all started up again. And it was a lot of very direct responses and very kind of informed responses. And this could well be from people just wanting to interpret the thing. There was an impression of laughter on the lights. They didn't just sort of light up and go back. Sometimes if you'd said something, they would flicker right off, as if it was a giggle. Yeah, you could really get a sense of somebody giggling down there. And the Kingmaker area, always, we've had a very strange experience with one of the voice generators, like the Oculus, that puts out words generated from the environment or that a spirit can pick up on. And one of our sensitives was in the room saying, "There's quite an aggressive man we've got an aggressive man, and he's kind of when somebody puts their fingers across the throat to show cutting, he's doing this, he's studying the thing and doing this, and then suddenly the Oculus comes up with cutting."
Wow.
and we were getting some quite interesting things with that. We had a photographer with us as well who was experimenting with very long exposures. So putting a camera in a very low lit room and just doing very long exposures. And we had some very strange things come out of that. Lots of kind of blue clouds, odd bits and pieces. Now, he's looking at these at the moment. He's going through a lot of the imagery. And it could well be that some of this is just natural light that bounces around. We've got a very strange silhouette where you could infer a lady in maybe quite a long gown. But then again, a lady in a long gown is quite an amorphous shape. So we've got some really interesting light play on those pictures. But yeah, it's an amazing area down in the Kingmaker. It really is.
Is there any, the research, obviously you being quite an investigator as opposed to just a sort of a ghost hunter, so to speak, Sean. Have you looked into why there could have been, other than the fact that it was a family home and everything else, saying about sort of anything malicious happening to children in Warwick Castle? Do you know of any stories of?
There is a story. There is a particular story. Are you happy for me to share it? Because again, I don't want anybody to go and suddenly think, this is what this is. But there is a story, a bit of a legend, about a lady of the kitchen staff that fell pregnant by somebody quite high up in the family, or certainly in the sort of the upper household. Be quite a scandalous thing. And when the baby was born, that both mother and baby were bricked up and left.
Right.
To avoid any scandal and to avoid any sort of negative
repercussions and
for those in power. Now, again, it's just a bit of local legend. This is a bit of thing. I don't know if there's any bones being found or anything like this, but it's odd that we pick up on these kind of energies at the times when we've been down there in the Kingmaker.
I suppose as well, looking back through sort of like 2,000 years worth of history and the fact that the families did live there, knowing what mortality rates were like for children anyway, it wouldn't be unusual if we really did go back through the records of all the earls who'd lived there and everything else, for some of their children not to have survived into adulthood, and that to have been their favourite place, because at the end of the day, somewhere like that would be awesome for a small child to be playing in, all the space, all the hiding places, and
people and the noise and the warmth. You're in the hottest part of the castle. You don't have very much heating maybe elsewhere. It's a place to sort of gravitate to, isn't it? That sort of hearth and warmth. All the impressions that we've ever had, though, these aren't sad children. These aren't lost. They feel at ease. They are happy. When you ask, "Are you happy?" We had a little boy in one of the towers. I forget the name of the tower. It's the large tower that's currently being renovated, and we were using a pen light. You know, when you have it just switched off and you ask the spirits to turn the torch on. And we had a very good conversation there with a young boy who, again, and we sort of said, are you trapped here? No. Can you roam? Can you go where you want? Yes. And it was this kind of like childlike freedom that was coming through, not a cry for help and not somebody who's in distress or hurt. This was more like, this is my home and this is where I go. And who wouldn't want to run around here?
So maybe it would have been children that died naturally and attached to the place, as opposed to children who were taken, a bit like the story of the princes in the Tower of London, who anyone who's seen them or encountered them say that they're very sad, they're scared, they're crying. Well, they didn't want to be there and they were murdered. Maybe that's the difference. Who knows? Who knows? Because we won't ever know. So that was the Kingmakers demo, if you like. Which other parts have you had a lot of sort of things happening that people have reported?
We've had so if you imagine the Kingmaker building is kind of 3 levels. So the Kingmaker is almost like an underground, not quite underground level, but it's like a lower ground level. As you work your way up through that building, you've got the apartments that were a home right up into the sort of 70s. This was the family home of the earls, and those rooms now have been set to like an Edwardian time.
Right.
So the rooms have been decorated and this and
So
and
the time of Daisy.
Exactly, the time of Daisy. And we've also got Daisy's room where we know that seances were conducted. Daisy was quite the socialite and
She was
quite
an Essex girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, she was. She was from Great Dunmow, apparently.
Yeah.
And
Well-
she really does give Essex girls a bad name.
Well, maybe she was the original. But perhaps this is where the name
Could
came
have
from.
been.
Because she
Could have
was
been.
a good time. She was part of that whole good time had by all scene.
I think so. I actually laughed when I was reading her biog and I found out she was from Essex. I thought, wow, that's going to sort of, that kind of epitomises what Essex girls are supposed to be like. In fact, she was married and not only reportedly sleeping with the Prince of Wales, but also everyone else as part of that Marlborough set or whatever it was called. I think. So that's her room then that you've experienced stuff in.
It has. It's got two entrances, Daisy's room. There's one which there's no public access. It kind of leads on to corridors, and a lot of the kind of security guys and these sorts of things and officers where the castle works is one door. Mm-hmm. Most people actually gain access to Daisy's room by following a corridor which runs along the Great Hall, which is an amazing place. So you're walking along this corridor, you look down into the Great Hall. The corridor must be 20, 30 metres long. Mm-hmm. And we've had a group in Daisy's room and something absolutely bang on the door that goes into the long gallery. Mm. Instantly, everybody jumped up and opened the door. Nothing to be seen. And this wasn't a slamming of a door in the wind. This was a thump, a proper thump on the door.
Yeah, it's the Prince of Wales getting impatient.
It could well be. It's like, come on, Daisy.
Hurry up, woman.
Come on, love. And on the last investigation we did, we were doing the walk around before our guests turned up. And we were just sort of going various rooms to room. These are the rooms we can use this evening. And again, another thing I will say about any group that wants to investigate Warwick, the team there are fantastic. They're generous with their time, with their knowledge, mm-hmm. and their enthusiasm. They are fantastic. So the team there was taking us round, and we went into Daisy's room, and the door which led to the staff part was wide open. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, that really shouldn't happen because we were just in here just now and everything was locked. Mm-hmm. So, again, a little bit of activity there. The odd thing is, though, with Daisy, this very specific character and this very much larger-than-life character, as a group, we've had no interaction that we could actually say, that's Daisy. Mm-hmm. So we're in her room and we're in her space and strange things have happened, but we've not actually been able to pin anything down to say, hi, Daisy, how are you doing? So, again, just a room kind of isolated on its own from when you look at it from the sort of public's point of view, kind of tucked away right at the top of the corner of the castle. Just some odd things happening there. We've had, in that same part, on the other side of the long gallery, so away from Daisy's room, we've seen white mist. Mm-hmm. We've had some odd things like that. Again, this is a part of the castle I could sit on my own all night, and I can be a bit of cowardly custard. But in there, I feel totally at home. It's a lovely atmosphere, I think, in there. I actually look forward to spending time with groups in there.
So is there any part of the castle you don't like being on your own in?
Yes. There's a particular tower, the Bear Tower.
Right.
And it's, from a purely non-spiritual point of view, it's dark and dank. It's a dark and dank tower. And it's a tiny, tiny tower. It's not very big. Been in there with some of our sensitives who've picked up on a very aggressive, negative male energy in there. And also with groups, it's an odd thing. The sort of, when you take a group in there, people tend to be a bit quieter, I've noticed. It's an odd thing. It's almost like a group feeling. You are quite... it's a smaller room. There's a bear pit in there where bear baiting and various things happened. But there is just an odd atmosphere. I probably wouldn't want to be on my own in there. And also the dungeon and the oubliette, again, an odd atmosphere down there.
Have you actually you investigate? Do you get to investigate down in that part of the castle then?
Far, yeah, absolutely. You can't
Ooh.
actually get into the oubliette itself.
I don't think I'd want to. Would you?
No, there's a grate across it. It's
Yeah.
enough for you to look in there and realise that's the place to just drop and forget people.
Yeah.
And
Which is pretty much what oubliette meant.
Yeah,
I think it means like the forgotten space or the forgotten person kind of thing. Whoa. So did you get? Have you had any sort of any experiences down in the oubliette?
We've had an odd thing. It's an odd place, the dungeon, because you get in there through very, very narrow and steep stone steps that lead in there. An odd thing that did happen that I can't actually explain. It's not very well lit down there, and when obviously in the night time, when you're doing the investigation, the lights are off. The only light that comes in there is from a couple of small lights which are on the stairs that lead in there. And we were in there, and one of our sensitives said, "There's a soldier coming down the stairs." And it could be because you've got the idea in your head, but it did appear to get darker on the staircase as this person approached. And while they were stood there, our sensitive was saying he's kind of aware of us, but he's confused about why we are here. He kind of knows that we're not supposed to be here, but he's just going to stand at the door and not challenge. And we've tried to do lots of different things down in the basement. Some people have tried pendulum work. Some people have tried the EMF. Some people have tried different things, and the flashlight as well. But every time we do that, you kind of get gibberish. This activity, but nothing you can actually get any kind of sense to. I know some people have, from the oubliette, got a sense of drowning, of people being short of breath and airless, and this claustrophobia.
Panic attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, nothing you could kind of specifically point at and say, all right, here's a ghost and this is the ghost of person X, Y, and Z. And what I think was fascinating is the dungeon itself is at the bottom of what's known as the Caesar Tower. And that was, in its time, the whole tower itself, right up to the very top, was a prison. And depending on how important and depending on your status as a prisoner, dictated how far up the tower you lived. So if you were a prize prisoner, you'd be in the top of the tower. You're still a prisoner, but hey, you're a prisoner at the top of a tower. You're not having to deal with the dark and dank of the common people down in the basement.
Wow, that's really interesting. Maybe next time, if I ever get back to Warwick at some point. I've been there a few times, but not to do an investigation. It sounds like it would be an interesting one, especially. I would be intrigued by the oubliette. I'd scares the living daylights out of me, the thought of being put into one of those. I'd probably try and kill myself if I got dropped into something like that, if I'm completely honest. Cause
you certainly wouldn't want to spend a great deal of time, and you could only hope that your end would come quickly in there.
Especially if they forget, they do genuinely forget, and so you don't get fed, you don't get water, so your body basically starts to eat itself from within.
And don't forget, you've got rats, you've got damp, you've got cold. You'll rot down there. I think
I'd probably bash my head against the wall until it burst, but I'm sure that did happen as well.
I'm sure it did.
Well, thank you ever so much for your time, Sean. I've really, really appreciated talking to you. If anyone has any comments or has experienced Warwick Castle for themselves, please do let us know on our Parasearch Facebook page. We'd love to hear the stories from you, and I'm sure we can pass them on to Sean and Ghost Ventures as well. Where can people look at what investigations Ghost Ventures have got coming up, Sean?
You can find us on Facebook and also on Instagram. Just type in Ghost Ventures and you'll find us there. And we're a really open, happy group. If you just want to come along and tag along on one of our investigations, you'd be so welcome. All from wherever you are, from the true believer to the uber skeptic, we're everybody's welcome, everybody's respected, and just come along, bring your energy, and have an amazing time with us.
Brilliant. Well, do look them up on Facebook. I actually have had a few friends go on investigations with you, and they've been very complimentary. So, with Ghost Ventures, I don't know if you were on it, Sean, I'm afraid, but I know at Ghost Ventures they were very complimentary. So, do look the group up. But all that leaves me to say to everyone is thank you for listening. Have a good evening. Sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.